Back in 1979, after the Iranian Revolution that saw the displacement of the longtime ruler, the Shah of Persia, and the installation of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini as the supreme leader of Iran. And right after seizing power, the new Iranian regime, one of their top priorities was the advancement and the rebuilding of Iran's armed forces. Now, while through the 1980s, China and North Korea were the primary suppliers of arms for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard, but things changed quite dramatically by the 1990s. Moscow became Tehran's main supplier of conventional weapons. Now, this was despite a 5-year trade suspension issued by Russia. This was from 1995 to 2000. And yet, the value of arms transfer between Moscow and Tehran was well in excess of $1 billion by the early 2000s. Now, among the various conventional weapons that Moscow has supplied Tehran over the years, there are 3 that stand out. 1, the transfer of Kilo-class submarines. 2, the S-300 surface-to-air missile systems. And 3, the MiG-29 fighter jets. These are 3 of the most significant weapons that have been transferred from Moscow to Tehran. And now, since the start of the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, Iran, though under pressure, has not taken a position that is antagonistic to Russia. Remember, Iran has a lot to lose in this conflict. Iran is right now engaged in a multilateral dialogue process with many Western countries, including the United States, about restarting the nuclear deal. So Iran does have a lot to lose in this conflict, and yet Iran is not taking a position that would anger Moscow. On Crux Decode, how Russia is using the Ukraine conflict to squeeze concessions out of Iran, how the stalled JCPOA talks around the nuclear deal benefit both Moscow and Tehran. Following the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ruhollah Khomeini, in 1989, Tehran emerged as a profitable client state for Moscow. At this time, Iran spearheaded a secret program aimed at acquiring fighter jets, missiles, as well as other military equipment. The 3 primary suppliers for Iran at that time were China, North Korea, and Russia. In fact, according to a New York Times report published back in the early 1990s, Iran had spent or committed to over $3 billion in arms purchases between 1988 and 1991. A bulk of this money went to Russia to buy MiG fighters and tanks. Iran's 2 MiG-29 squadrons that are currently there as part of its Air Force arsenal, they represent some of the most modern and sophisticated combat jets as part of the Iranian air fleet. Back in 1990, Iran received its first delivery of 18 MiG-29s. 1 year later, 4 additional fighters were evacuated to Iran following Operation Desert Storm. Now, while these 4th-generation airframes are rather old, some of them would say it's outdated, but they continue to be the bulwark of Iran's Air Force. Now, while the MiG-29s improve Iran's Air Force capabilities, the Russian-built Kilo-class submarines enhance Iran's naval defenses. Now, the Kilo-class first entered service back in the 1980s in the Soviet Union. They made their way to Iran's naval arsenal over the next decade. The 3,000-ton diesel-electric Kilos, they represent some of the most advanced submarines that Tehran has. In addition to the MiG-29s and the Kilo-class submarines, the Russian-made S-300 long-range surface-to-air missiles, or the SAMs, they also contribute heavily to Iran's conventional arms arsenal. The SAMs are regarded as one of the most potent anti-aircraft missile systems in operation. The SAMs are able to engage with aircraft, with other unmanned aerial vehicles. They are also equipped with cruise and ballistic missile defense capabilities. Now, since this special military operation in Ukraine began, there has been immense pressure on Tehran to recalibrate its position vis-à-vis Moscow. After all, the entire Iran nuclear deal, which was dismantled under the previous US administration of Donald Trump, that was being revived in Vienna. The same players that's P5 plus Iran, were being brought back to the negotiating table in a bid to try and see if the stalled nuclear deal can be revived. Now, Iran badly needs this deal to go through. Iran has been facing some of the most crippling sanctions over the last few years because these talks fell through. But there are no signs yet that Tehran is walking away from its relationship with Moscow. Remember, Moscow is not entirely in favor of an expedited dialogue to eventually get Iran and the Western powers on the same page as far as nuclear equation is concerned. And yet at the same time, there's immense pressure on Iran to condemn Russia's actions in Ukraine. Now, any improvement in Iran's relationship with the West will always be a concern for Russia. Now, if you go back to March, Russia had made a demand for a written guarantee from the United States that trade with Iran will not be affected. Of course, Russia was worried that the new US sanctions as well as European Union sanctions that have been imposed on Russia in the aftermath of this special military operation will have a knock-on secondary effect on trade between Russia and Iran. Now, this is the latest example of how Moscow is playing the Iran card to jeopardize Tehran's interests to secure its own. And remember, this is not the first time that Russia has used the nuclear talks to achieve its own ends. Former Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif, for example, in an interview back in March of last year, this was a leaked interview, he was asked about Russia's rather destructive role in the Iran nuclear talks. And this is what he said, very interesting, and I quote, "The Russians have been trying to prevent this nuclear deal since 2015. And Foreign Minister Lavrov wanted to disrupt everything on the night of the agreement. After the JCPOA, when Lavrov returned to Russia, he was attacked by the Russian media asking him why he would allow this agreement to be reached and allow Iran to get closer to the West." Unquote. Now, on the other hand, Russia does not want Iran to become a full-fledged nuclear weapons state, or for that matter, be subjected to sanctions. Now, the reason Russia wants to keep this issue on the boil is because if there were to be outright sanctions on Iran or as a consequence on Russia, that would undermine both trade as well as technical relations between Moscow and Tehran. So Russia's policy is basically to keep the whole issue on simmer, to maintain various crises that can be controlled and hinder the improvement of ties between Iran and the West. So that makes Iran's dependence on Moscow that much more. Russia is seeking to revive the agreement because the alternatives are not acceptable to Russia. They're certainly not attractive to Russia. Let's say, for example, if Iran were to acquire nuclear weapons, were to go full throttle nuclear. Now, it is possible that emboldened by this action, some of the other actors, maybe some of them closer to Russia, like Turkey or even Azerbaijan, may want to go in the same direction as Iran. Not just that, other Arab countries in the Persian Gulf, if they were to be emboldened by Iran's actions and decide to acquire nuclear weapons, that could be potentially destabilizing for Russia. Remember, Russia has huge stakes in the Middle East, not just in what's going on between Israel and the Palestinian territories, but remember, Russia has been actively involved in the Syrian civil war for a number of years now. It also has a major stake in the ongoing thaw, as it were, between the United States and Israel on the one hand, and the Gulf cooperation countries led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the other. For Russia, it is a simple proposition. A pro-Western Iran is far more dangerous than a nuclear Iran. Russia fears that a further expansion of Iran's nuclear program could lead to a new conflict in the region and therefore a bigger US military presence. That is something that Russia can ill afford.